Number 1. Joyride. This happened when I was really young. I was at my grandma's house. She was divorced from her husband long before I was born. She lived with her 2 youngest sons, who were a lot younger than my parents were. My grandma, my aunts, and my dad were the type to go to bars a whole lot, and whenever we went to visit Grandma, they would leave all of us cousins at home, while they went out drinking. My mom went with them because my dad insisted, but she had never been much of a drinker. My 2 uncles, the ones that lived with my grandma, were underage too, but they were supposed to be the ones watching us, but they weren't much older than us. This was just sort of the way my family was back then. This night it was like that. Everyone had been gone for a while. My uncles and my elder brother knew that our parents would be out for a long time, so they had what they thought was a good idea. They were going to take the keys to my grandma's pickup truck and go for a ride. Now, of course, they were not allowed to do anything like this, and they were not allowed to leave us alone. So they decided that the 3 of them would sit in the front of the truck, and the rest of us 4 cousins would be sitting in the bed. There wasn't a top on the truck, so we were basically sitting outside. My grandma lived way out in the country. The roads that we were driving on were narrow country roads that winded through the hills. To make things worse, my brother and uncles had taken a few beers out of the fridge and were drinking them while driving the truck around. To give you a bit of an idea of how rural this was and how thin the road was, we several times had to duck to keep branches from scratching us in the face. Now, I was the oldest of the 4 cousins in the back of the truck, and I was only 9 years old, so you can imagine how scary an experience this was for us. It was dark as hell, and the only light was in front of the truck. And then, they stopped the truck at the end of a driveway. Taking their BB guns, they told the 4 of us to remain there until they got back. I was a 9-year-old, left with 3 younger children in the back of a truck in the hills in the middle of the freaking night. I guess it was my job to keep us from being scared, but I was scared myself. So all I could do was sit there with the other 3 kids, looking around and trying not to be too frightened. And then we heard a gunshot. No, it wasn't a BB gunshot, it was a gunshot. All 3 of my younger cousins began crying right away. I pulled them closer to me and tried to keep them from being too frightened, but it was hard for me to do that as I was terrified. It wasn't long before my 2 uncles and my brother came running toward the truck. They got into it fast and yelled for us to keep our heads down. So we did. My uncle took off like a bat out of hell. He didn't have time to turn around, so we just went deeper and deeper into the hills. The driveway he was at was the last place he could have turned around, but I guess he kept looking for another. All 4 of us in the back kept hunkered down. However, I heard my uncles freaking out because they had gotten us lost. They didn't know how to get back, and it seemed like they were just as scared as we were. I peeked up a few times, but it was too dark for me to see anything. We drove around for what seemed like forever in the dark. The other 3 children were still crying, convinced we were going to never make it back home, and I was young enough to think that was true. Eventually, though, there was a light ahead of us. My brother and uncles lost their shit. They thought that the person who had shot at them had found them, but it was even worse for them than that. It was my mom. Our parents had gotten home, and were all drunk and noticed we were gone. So my mom came out looking for them with one of my aunts. My mom put us kids in the car. They put my brother and my 2 uncles in the back of the truck. My aunt drove the truck home, while my mom drove the car home. Well, what happened was that there was this old man who made moonshine and was basically a hermit, and my brother and uncles went to steal some moonshine from him. When they noticed him, they shot him with a BB gun. So he grabbed his gun and he shot back. Of course, my brother and uncles were in deep shit. I don't support spanking your kids, but after what happened, when my grandma handed each one of them a pocket knife and told them, "All three of you, go cut me a switch," I didn't feel any sympathy for them whatsoever. Number 2. Hitchhiking. I ran away from home when I was a teenager. I just was not getting along with my stepfather, and I decided I needed to get away from my family. I had some cash saved up from my part-time job. Plus, I took some money from my stepfather too. I guess I should feel bad about telling you that, but I really don't. He was an asshole, and I don't even mind to this day if he knew that I took the money. So I set off to God knows where. I mean, I really didn't have a plan. I thought I would walk and maybe hitchhike my way across the country. I thought I might go to California, and yeah, I know how cliche that is. But I was underage, and California for some reason seemed like a good idea. I had enough money that I could have taken a bus or something, but I didn't want to do that either. I think it was because I had no idea what I was going to do when I got there, and I wanted to take the time to think about it. Besides, if I was hitchhiking, I might end up finding something or someone interesting along the way. My story happened after I had actually made some distance in my journey. I walked a whole lot, and I actually got some rides too. A few of the rides were with guys in semi-trucks, and I thought that was pretty neat. The truck drivers were the ones I liked the most. I was just leaving a town, walking my way out, hitching, when a red car pulled over. I got in and introduced myself to the guy driving. His name was Tony, or so he told me. He was just a normal guy, like you'd expect to see working in an office building or something like that. He was going to a town that I was going to be going through, and let me know he could drop me off there. I should probably mention that I didn't travel much when I was a kid, so I didn't know much about what the country looked like on the way to California. Though Tony and I were chatting on the ride, and that was convenient, there was something about him that I didn't like. I could not put my finger on it, but it seemed like the entire thing was forced talking to me. I told myself simply that he was just not used to picking up hitchhikers, and maybe he was slightly uncomfortable. So, I decided to test that thought. "So, you pick up hitchhikers very often?" I asked him. Tony nodded. "Oh yeah," he replied. "Quite a few, actually. I figure it's no big deal. I know some people think it's risky or scary, but hey, if I can help someone make it a few miles, then that makes me very happy." He stopped for a moment and looked at me. "So, I'm glad I can help." Again, there was something off about Tony. Even his comment, it seemed a bit stilted, a bit forced. One thing I did notice, however, is that he never drove on the interstate. We were driving down a regular highway, of course, so there were traffic lights and things like that, but it seemed odd to me that he never drove on the freeway. There were no tolls and no traffic lights, so it made more sense. But I just thought maybe it wasn't his thing. We kept driving. We went through several towns, and after that, he began driving further away from the freeways. We were driving through the towns, and then we were going through less populated roads. We were no longer on the highway. We were just following routes. I'd been in the car with Tony for a few hours when we were going through a rather hilly area, and I just couldn't understand why he was driving through that. And I didn't want to ask him either, because it seemed just like weird of me to do that. So I decided just to remain quiet as we went on. But the further we drove, the more it seemed like he was not trying to take me to the city that I was going to. I wasn't the best with directions, but I knew we were not going the way that we were supposed to be going. I asked him about it at one point, and he just told me he liked to take the scenic routes, and that he hoped that I didn't mind. At one point we stopped at a gas station. He got back to the car before I did, and I think that I startled him, as he was holding something, and he tried to hide it under his seat. It made me uneasy, but I still got into the car with him. Things then got really odd. While we were driving on the roads, he turned off onto a much more rural road. Things quickly changed from even the small town vibe to the strangest and strongest of rural vibes. But that was not nearly as strange nor nearly as frightening as when he drove onto a gravel road that was taking us up a hill. I began to get very nervous due to this really weird change. I kept telling myself that maybe the road led out to another road that would take us back onto asphalt. However, as we traveled further and further into the dark road into the hills, I began to get a lot more nervous. We continued to make the small talk that we had been making for quite a while. Finally, the road pulled up to a gate. Looking out past the gate, I noticed that there was a long driveway that led up to a house. "Where are we?" I asked Tony. "Oh, I just needed to make this stop to pick something up," he told me. "You wait here and I will be right back." Tony got out of the car. He hopped over the gate and began walking up to the house. When he was out of sight, I decided to check and see what it was that he had stuffed under his seat at the gas station earlier. Reaching under his chair, I pulled out a large knife. At that point, everything that happened that evening came together in my mind. There was the strange behavior of Tony when we talked, seeming like he was hiding something from me. The actual hiding the knife under the seat of the car when he saw me coming back from the station. And finally, this weird trip up into the hills that made no sense at all. It was all too weird. He had taken the car keys with him. Honestly, if he had left them in the car, I would have driven his car out of there. But I didn't have that option. I left the car though, and I took the knife with me. I ran down the road a bit, and then went off into the trees. I had been hitchhiking for a long time anyway, so it didn't bother me to have to walk out of the hills, back to where I had to go. I kept going through the woods for as long as I could. I didn't stray too far from the road though. A few times Tony's car drove by, and I noticed him shining his flashlight out into the woods. However, I was always hiding in a good spot, and he never noticed me. But he was surely looking for me, which then just reinforced my paranoia that he was up to no good at all. I kept walking until I got back to the normal road. It took me a couple hours, but I did make it back. And then I was able to make it to the next town without any problem. But walking on the open road was a lot scarier than walking in the woods had been. At least then I had a hiding place. As I was walking along the open road, I kept expecting every car to drive by to be Tony's car. and I expected something bad to happen. Nothing ever did. I made it to town, and the following day I was picked up by another semi-truck. For the rest of the trip, I just rode in the semi-trucks because that seemed safer to me. I mean, those guys were working, and were not likely to try to kidnap me or whatever. I admit that I really have no idea if Tony was up to no good, but the pieces of the puzzle, all put together, seemed to indicate it. Number 3. The light. When I was a young teenage boy, I guess I wasn't obsessed with all of the same things as all the other guys were obsessed with. Don't get me wrong, I liked girls, but I wasn't just trying to get girls in the sack all the time. No, I was in search of love. And I was just hoping I would be able to find it at such a young age. It feels a bit silly now, being older, and realizing how difficult a thing love is to come by as an adult, much less a kid who really knows nothing about it. Of course, I would never have had the nerve to ask any girl out on a date. Most of all, I would start liking some girl, whether she was out of my league or not. And then I would pine for a while, walk around with my head down, depressed at myself for being like that. And I guess you're wondering what this has to do with my story. Well, it's just setting up, so you can understand what I was going through at the time. I had a crush on this girl when I was 14, and I nearly had up the nerve to ask her on a date. But it was the end of the school year, and I let my chance skip right by me. And I knew I wouldn't see her again until the end of summer, because she didn't live anywhere near me. So I realized I'd be spending the whole summer alone. I spent the summer not being able to sleep well. I would get up and go for walks then. I would walk with my head down, watching my feet kick rocks on the road. It was during one of these walks at night that I came across something really, really scary. I lived in a house that was just down the road from a hill. There was a small neighborhood right there. And normally when I walked around, I would walk in that neighborhood. But this time, I walked down the road and went over to a road that led up into the hill. I had never been on the hill before, mostly because I figured it was the property of someone else. But this time, I wanted to go somewhere that I had not been before. So as I walked along, I looked up at the hill and decided to take the road that way. Like I said, I was feeling pretty down and out at the time, so I just spent all the time in deep thought. The road I took wasn't one that I had ever been on before. I was walking uphill. All the way to the top of the hill, there were no driveways or anything like that. But I wasn't surprised because a lot of these old country roads led to houses of people who wanted to live way out in the country, as rural as possible. Now, it was when the road got to the top of the hill, and then I was beginning to descend a bit, that things started to get a little weird. The road wound down the hill, and eventually around another one. But what I noticed at the bottom of the hill was some sort of light. It was hard to tell what it was coming from at first, so I walked a little bit downhill in order to see if I could try and make out what it was. After walking for a while, I discovered that what I was looking at was a car with its headlights on. However, the car was not in motion. It was just sitting in the road, but it was sitting sideways, so it was blocking the road. The lights were shining off of the road, down into the forest. I was both curious and a little freaked out by it. It didn't make sense to me that someone would be blocking the road. and of course that meant that I was not going to be walking down the road much further. I didn't really want to come into contact with anyone. And then there were 3 gunshots. Shotgun shots. I was startled, nearly jumping out of my skin. I guess after hearing gunshots, I should have turned and left. I was scared, but I was also a bit curious as to what might have been going on. So I stood there, and I watched for a little bit, wondering if I was going to hear anything else. I didn't, but I did see something. The car was moving. It straightened up in the road, and the lights were now on the road. And the car started moving very slowly, driving on the road, toward me. I retreated a little bit. The car was moving very, very slowly. I was able to make it back up to the top of the hill. But by then I realized that even though it was moving slowly, it was still moving faster than me. I began to get a little scared, and I had good reason to. There was no reason that I could think of that someone would be shooting a shotgun at nighttime. Hunting in that area was definitely not allowed after dark, and besides, I doubted that hunting was allowed in that area at all. Of course, I wasn't sure about that. I decided to get off the road and let the car pass. But my curiosity was still piqued, wanting to figure out what was going on. So I got a bit off the road, and I climbed up a tree. That way, I could see the car as it passed. It took a while before the car came into view, but when it did, I was shocked at what I saw. There was indeed an old car driving up the hill, but there were 3 men in front of the car. They were all carrying shotguns. They were walking slowly while someone in the car was shining a spotlight out on the side of the road. They were obviously looking for something. Fortunately, the light never shone up into the tree that I was in. I can't tell you that there was anything abnormal looking about the men. They just looked like country boy types. But the fact that they had shot at something earlier and were now obviously looking for something in the woods scared me deeply. Either they were up to no good, or they were hunting something that was up to no good. Those were the only 2 options I was able to think about. So I waited until they passed, and after they passed I waited longer. I was scared to death at that point. I wasn't thinking that they were doing something wrong, but I still did not want to take that chance. I was more scared that there was something or someone on the woods that they were after, and that was the most terrifying part of it. Wondering whether or not I was out in the woods with maybe some escaped lunatic or something even worse, if there is something even worse. I waited a bit, and finally got the nerve to climb down the tree. I made my way back over to the road, and began walking from where I had come from. And it was nerve-wracking. Every moment I was expecting something to jump out at me. And at that point, my mind was coming up with so many possibilities about what may have been going on back there. The car didn't come back. I was able to make it back to the asphalt road, but my nerves were shattered by the time I did. I was literally trembling, and was not comfortable until I made it all the way back to my home. It turned out that I was partly right. There were 2 men who had escaped from the county jail the day before. Both were up on some pretty nasty charges, so I came to the conclusion that the guys I saw were probably looking for them or something. I don't know for sure, but I began wondering if I had moved in the woods, if they would have shot at me, thinking I was one of those escaped prisoners. Well, anyway, I suppose I should tell you that I never thought about that girl again. She completely skipped my mind until school next year, and by then I wasn't interested anymore. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to click the subscribe button and bell below, or click the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.